So we are dealing with Jesus' mission. Of course, this is the third of three little parts in Luke that we've called the unexpected Messiah. So we have the unexpected venue. That is, Jesus gathers his followers from a very unlikely place out there in the hinterland, as it were, of Israel. Then we have the unexpected message. We thought the Messiah, this great conquering king, would come in with overwhelming force, and what do we find out? His weapons are weapons of love and mercy, of forgiveness, and so on. It's very unexpected. And now we have the mission. What is the mission of Messiah? And this is the most lengthy, but I think there is a kind of internal coherence. I hope I'm not just bringing this to the text. I hope I'm discovering it in the text. One always wonders, There's a traditional distinction between what's called exegesis and eisegesis. Exegesis is finding what's in the text and bringing it out. Eisegesis is bringing to the text what you want to find there, and kind of forcing it on it. And I hope I'm not doing eisegesis here, but it seems to me there is a kind of progress in the mission of Jesus that culminates in his attack on hell itself, which takes place ultimately at the cross, but we're getting the introduction to that here. And so what does it start with? It's a liberation message. Jesus is a liberator. This is the woman who was overwhelmed in her own sinful life, and yet freed by Christ, she comes and pours out herself to him, washing his feet with her tears and so on. He divides. As Jesus goes into every aspect of the human population, indeed even in our own lives, we find he's dividing. He's separating. The sower tells us that the seed falls on all kinds of ground, but most of it ultimately doesn't respond positively. It's only a relatively small part that does. To those who respond, he reveals. Jesus is one who brings to light the hidden things. He's not a mystery religion cult leader, which was quite common in the ancient world. He is one who wants everything out in the open. That which was spoken in secret will be shouted from the housetops. That's the spirit of the gospel. The gospel is that which brings out into the sunlight those things that may have otherwise seemed obscure. Well, I played around all week for a word here, and now my present word. Last I said it was unite. I've abandoned that one. I appreciated some good suggestions last week, but I didn't go with those. And right now, I'm going to use the word to generate, meaning he creates family. He makes us a family. And of course, the root of the word generate is gene. So he creates your spiritual genetics. Isn't that cute? A little too cute, actually, but to generate. He generates family. Oh, sorry, you remind me of my wife, I tell you. Though that it is crossed. It's crossed. Now, I always tell the kids at school the reason I can't write is because I'm so old. I was educated in a cave, and we used chalk and charcoal on the cave walls. And just to please, there you are. Oh, much better. Thank you. To generate. Last week we finished up, he protects. Jesus is out there on the water with his disciples. The storm blows in, and he's the one who protects them in the face of that great threat. Now this one's another one that's a little too cute, but I'll try to... the word I've used there is sanitize, but actually the root of it that I'm concerned about is sane. Sane, S-A-N-E. He sanitizes. That's how you spell sane, isn't it? He makes us sane. I remember Dale Bruner used to say, Jesus is the sanest man that ever lived. And he imparts a little of that sanity to us. We live in a world that is given over in many cases to the most outrageous forms of insanity, even among those who are supposed to be balanced, He brings rationality. He brings a sound mind. And so that's what I'm after here. So I don't mean sanitize in the sense of cleaning, but I mean sanitizing. I'm sure I'll come up with something better than that eventually, but that was the best I could do this week. Oh, the demo. Well, I just ran out of energy. What I was going to write here was the demon-possessed man, but I get impatient, so kind of that's what's there. The demon-possessed man. This is the story that's before us this morning. I'm sorry. Speaking of sane minds, yeah. Thank you for your patience. All right, we are in Luke chapter 8, then, beginning at verse 26. And this is a fairly lengthy story, a well-known story. But it is the story, of course, of you'll hear it variously, either the Gergesene or Gadarene Demoniac. And I'll say a little bit about why that little distinction shows up. But let's go ahead and read it first. Beginning at verse 26, Luke chapter 8, this is the word of God. They arrived in the country of the Gergesenes, which is opposite Galilee. And having departed onto the land, they were met by a man having demons, who for a long time had worn no clothing, nor lived in a house, but among the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell at his feet, and with a loud voice said, "What do I have to do with you, Jesus, Son of God the Most High? Have you come to... do not torment me. I beg you, do not torment me." My Greek vocabulary, I'm still working on it. Because he had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. On many occasions, he had been seized, and they had bound him with chains and shackled his feet. But he'd broken the chains and been driven by the demons into the wilderness. Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Legion," because many demons had entered into him. And they besought him that he would not send them into the abyss. There was there a herd of swine feeding on the mountain, and they besought him that he would send them into those, and he sent them. The demons departed from the man and entered into the swine, and the herd stampeded down the precipice into the lake and was drowned. When those who were feeding them, the herdsmen, saw what had happened, they fled and reported in the city and in the country. And they went out to see what had happened and came to Jesus and found the man who had had the demons sitting, clothed, and in his right mind, right at the feet of Jesus. And they were terrified. When those who had seen reported how the man had been saved, they besought him, all that crowd from the Gergesenes, to depart from them, because great fear had taken all of them. And he went back to the boat to return. The man from whom the demons had been cast out asked to go with Jesus, but he sent him away. "Return to your own house and declare what great things God has done for you." So he went and in the whole city reported what great things Jesus had done for him. So there's our text. Let's ask God's blessing on our reflection on it. Heavenly Father, we are grateful for your abundant mercy to us. We thank you this morning for this wonderful illustration of one who was at the very outer edges of the most horrific circumstances of human existence, and yet in a moment you brought him back, and you restored to him a sanity of mind and a soundness of thought. And we pray that we might in some way appreciate that that's what you have done all through history, wherever you have gone, and that we ourselves this morning might be the recipients of that great gift. Give you thanks for it in the name of Christ. Amen. All right. Well, fairly lengthy, got a lot to cover, but I think we can make it through. He came to the country of the Gergesenes, which is on the opposite side of Galilee. Now, Matthew and Mark both give this the name Gadarenes. Luke gives it Gergesenes. And then in a later kind of edition of Luke that comes from the 2nd century, you find that sort of lined out and the word Gergesene is put in. The whole thing is a bit mysterious. And the problem is that when it comes to that kind of more or less rural geography in the 1st century, there's a lot of questions that still abide, so we simply don't know necessarily where exactly this was. There's been some dispute, and you can imagine this is the thing that people go out and write PhD theses trying to figure out, but for the rest of us it may not have that much significance. It's sort of like imagining 2,000 years from now somebody trying to figure out, now where was Adams County again? It's one of those little places that I'm sure had significance at the time, but later on maybe not so much. The thing that is more or less lurking behind this question, however, is this one, and this is unresolved, continues to be debated to this day. Was this region populated mainly by Jewish people, or was it Gentile people? Because, of course, they're herding swine. And as you know, in the Jewish kosher rules, pigs are unclean, and it is forbidden of Jewish people to either be involved in herding pigs or raising them, and certainly selling them, especially for food. All of that would be off limits. Now, whether these people are Jewish or Gentile, one thing is clear, that they are doing it in a region that is dominated by the Jewish presence. This is still a region that is under the rule of Antipas, who's a son of Herod, and he represents at least one of the rulers of the Jewish world, and so it would have been, at least ordinarily, something that would have been illegal to do. So that seems to be a consensus among scholars, is that whatever's going on here, that it is something that's not supposed to take place in that region at that time. So view this herd of swine something like a poppy field growing opium, or a marijuana, something like that. In other words, this is contraband. This is a market, an activity, a commercial venture, which is at best marginal and probably simply illegal. That may help us understand part of why the story plays out the way it does. It seems to come into the general kind of design or paradigm in the Bible of what's called judgment redemption, where you'll have simultaneously an event of judgment and yet at the same time a redemptive effect as well. The same event is both, on the one hand, punishing, and on the other hand, saving. You think about the Exodus. There's a great judgment that happens, and yet there's a great salvation at the very same moment in the very same event. The flood. It's a great judgment, and yet there's a salvation, Noah and the ark. Sodom and Gomorrah, there's a great judgment, and yet there's a great liberation there, Lot and his family. That kind of motif runs through the Scriptures in the Old and New Testament. Indeed, the book of Revelation is kind of organized around that, fundamentally, that broad motif. And here we have another little hint of it. So it seems that what Christ is doing is an event of judgment against illegal activity, and at the same time a great event of redemption, you see, in terms of this man. So that's sort of backdrop to it, and that at least is part of what's being implied by this mention of the swine and the Gergesenes and so on. All right. Having arrived, having gotten out of the boat, implied here, and going onto the land, he was met by this man from the city who had demons. And for a long time he had not worn clothing, nor lived in a house, but had remained there among the tombs. This, of course, brings us once again to this somewhat intriguing and somewhat difficult question of demon possession generally, as we find, of course, in the New Testament, it comes up with some degree of frequency. There is in the New Testament a candid assumption that there is such a thing as demon possession. There is also in the ancient world a candid assumption that there is demon possession. At this point, the New Testament is in some rather consistent accord with what was otherwise taken to be the case in ancient writers. So you'll hear not only the New Testament, but you'll hear Tacitus, you'll hear Suetonius, you'll hear other ancient authors speak of this same phenomenon. Now, they may not call it demon possession as such. That sort of assumes a kind of biblical outlook, but they certainly do think in terms of people who are possessed by various kinds of spirits, and under the influence of those spirits do various kinds of things. Sometimes they function as oracles. You know, you have an allusion to that in the account of Paul in the city of Philippi. The oracle of Delphi is sometimes associated with a kind of possession by a spirit. You hear of familiar spirits, and you'll hear that kind of reference in the ancient literature generally. And so, whatever we make of this, we're certainly reading the New Testament in a context where this kind of phenomenon is more or less taken for granted. In the modern age, of course, you have a variety of opinions. I've read commentators who say, well, this is obviously just an example of mental disorder. And the only way the ancients knew how to describe it was in terms of demons, and so that's what they did. But actually, we, of course, as enlightened people of the more modern age, realize that that's not the case. Well, I'm not so sure about that personally. I think the New Testament probably should be taken a little bit more seriously in its descriptions. But I think it is interesting that as you read the history of the church, you do find that ancient historians will talk about demon possession generally disappearing, that it wanes in the aftermath of the rising influence of the gospel. So Athanasius, for example, in the early 4th century, talks about how rampant was demon possession 2 or 3 centuries earlier. But as the gospel had continued to dominate the Roman world, you saw less and less of demon activity. And he simply attributes that to the general effects, kind of the secondary overflow effect of the gospel. Doesn't mean everybody in Rome was becoming Christians, but simply the presence of the gospel had an effect of driving darkness into the shadows. I remember so well, I think I may have mentioned this when we covered this or touched on this some weeks back when Dale Bruner was here years ago. And some of us, not all of us, but some of us, of course, were privileged to have his instruction at our disposal. And he talked about his experience in the Philippines. Very much a third world kind of setting. And talked at that time. He said, Dale himself candidly admitted he was a product of the modern age and had some skepticism about demon possession till he went to the Philippines. He said, you go into some of those rural villages in the Philippines and say to some of those folks, oh, don't you know demon possession is just a mental disorder? They would laugh you right out of the town. It was so real to them, so significant a part of their, kind of culture, and the importance of the Christian minister being one who could exorcise demons. If you couldn't do that, they weren't so sure you even qualified as a Christian missionary. You see, that was just part of what you were supposed to be able to do. And so, whatever we make of that, I think we want to at least give the benefit of the doubt here to the biblical text that there is this kind of strange, unseen world, which is always with us, and yet in the name of Christ cannot touch us, and that's really one of the great messages here. So, we have this guy, he's described in these strange terms. He doesn't wear clothing, he's out among the tombs, etc., and most commentators, while they may take varying positions about the nature of demon possession, all of them unite in saying at least what this story is telling us is a story of how desperate are our circumstances, how ugly can be the effects of evil in our lives, and yet how powerful is the redemptive presence of Christ. That seems to be a theme that all the commentators unite on, regardless of how they may deal with some of the details. So we'll certainly take that at least for granted here. Verse 28, when he saw Jesus, he shrieked. It's really the word, anakroxis. He shrieked. an exclamation of just terror. He fell. Fell on his face is really the force of the word there, before him, and in a loud voice cried out, "What do I have to do with you?" Like, what did I do this time? It's sort of the impression, like a little kid kind of, that sort of reaction. Jesus, Son of God, the Most High, I beg you, do not torment me. So there's an amazing response now by this demon. The demon responds in terror. This, of course, is a theme we've seen before as we survey. Certainly we've already seen it even in Luke and in other gospel accounts. We find this sense in which the demons respond to Jesus with sheer panic. They have this, in a sense, we would almost think a vision of Christ that was concealed from the people that were just right there with him. They saw Jesus, a remarkable man, but somehow the demons saw something else, and it was to that they were giving this cry of terror. It reminds, Tolkien had a sense of this, and in his book he describes it well, and the movies did a pretty good job. If you saw the Lord of the Rings, that one of those scenes where Frodo, you remember this, if you saw the movie, he would put on the ring, right? And all of a sudden what happens? He's kind of transported into a different, not the different place, a same place, but a different reality, right? And all of a sudden he sees all of the forces of evil, all of the unseen things that are there, and they're all playing out in a very real way, but most of us are blind to it. We don't have eyes to see it. That is really kind of a biblical idea. Paul says our warfare is not with flesh and blood. We're not just carrying on battles that are confined to the material, matter, energy, space, and time kind of universe. There's something else. And he talks about principalities and powers and mights and dominions and sort of a whole unseen reality, and that's where our warfare is being carried on. And the New Testament more or less takes that for granted. You almost get the feeling the demons are seeing it from that perspective. They see this glorious, overwhelming, powerful one in Christ, Son of the Most High, and they're just immediately completely daunted by him. But the rest of us don't quite see all of that. We're just here kind of in our, three-dimensional world, and it may be a little bit more obscure to us. The demon reacts here, what do I have to do with you? It's an idiomatic expression, and that's about the best way to render it, but of course, the force of it is, why are you in my space? What connection do we have to each other? Just leave me alone, kind of thing, and so that's the force of it. That's the idea. It is, I think, however we want to construe this in terms of this demon-possessed man, not an unusual attitude. I have friends, as do you, and if I try to broach the topic of church, Christ, the gospel, stuff like that, they just, well, that's just not for me. And they don't say it in these words, but it's almost that attitude. What do I have to do with that? That's nice for some people, but that's just not my bag, That's great for you. You're a kind of a church guy, and that's okay. But, and maybe I will be someday, and you almost get the feeling that what's really going on there is a little bit of indifference. But I think what this text is teaching us is that behind the indifference maybe something a little bit more sharp, like actual fear, that there's a fear of Christ. There's a terror. People don't like the idea of Jesus intruding. In the public square, folks are afraid of Christians. They're going to come in and cram their values down our throat. I've never met a Christian who wanted to run around cramming their values down somebody's throat. Where is that person, But you would think that's what we're all doing, the way it's sometimes presented in the press. Like we're just out there trying to beat people, into wearing real dark clothing and never smiling or something. That's what we're all about. And you think, where's this terror coming from? What makes Jesus so scary? And when people say, well, I have no connection with Jesus, what's behind that? It's the demon here, of course, gets much closer to the heart of the matter. Are you going to torment me? There's this fear that Jesus will torment. It's a fear of torment. I have to say to you, I hate to admit it, but there are probably points in my life right now where I'm afraid Jesus is going to torment me. Jesus, now don't bother with that part of my life, that nice, neat little place there. You don't need to look in there. Do we feel that? There's this fear that Jesus is going to make us miserable. That's why people stay away from church, stay away from the gospel. They're afraid that Christ is going to torment them. The demon is afraid. Well, in his case, he had good reason to be afraid. Jesus indeed intended to, in some sense, torment him. But it was to save this man, not to injure him. And Jesus will torment us sometimes to chase out our demons. We may think, well, I like that demon. We've gotten sort of comfortable with each other. I don't know if I can get along without that demon, I'm 98% Christian, but that little 2% demon there, I don't know. And are you going to torment that demon out of me? Well, Jesus may make war on your demons, for your good. So the demon may have had the right idea. Matthew adds a little additional note here that Luke does not. I'm not quite sure why, because I think it's compatible with Luke's general point. But Matthew puts this as a question, and the question, you may recall, goes like this. Are you going to torment us before the time? Remember that? So that's Matthew's recitation of this same line. What do I have to do with you? Are you going to torment us prematurely? It's a very intriguing little comment there. And it implies that in the New Testament there is this kind of timetable that the demons seem to have been aware of. That there is a sense in which it was too early for Jesus to torment, in the sense of send to hell or send to the abyss these demons, that the time has not yet come. In a sense, that's where this whole thing's culminating. The whole mission of Christ is eventually going to bring him to the very doorstep of hell. All of the things he's doing are, in a sense, remedying the effects of evil being dominant in this world, but ultimately he has to get to the heart of the matter. The gates of hell will not prevail ultimately against the church, against the gospel, against its message. Jesus has to go, in a sense, right to those gates, you see. And in some ways, it hasn't happened yet. The demon can say, well, it's too early. The battle hasn't been fought. The outcome isn't certain from the demon's point of view, you might be thinking. And there is a kind of timetable sense. Jesus goes to the cross, he's raised from the dead, and then and only then does he say to his disciples, now all authority is given unto me. Now go and do these things and so on. There's a great conquest that gives Jesus the right to make that claim. Luke doesn't mention that, but I think it's worth bearing in mind. All right, we're at verse 29. Let's see. Verse 29, he had commanded, or he had told, really, a softer word, the unclean spirits to come out of him. And then this little explanatory comment. On many occasions, they had seized him. And it's unclear in the Greek text whether the having been seized is referring to the demons having seized the man, or the townspeople among whom he lived having seized him. And it goes either way, so I'll just leave it up to you. Your translations are going to put it one way or the other. They had seized him, and then they had bound him with chains, clearly referring to the people of that region, and shackled his feet, but he broke the chains, and the demons had driven him into the wilderness. So there'd been every attempt by conventional means to control this guy. The other gospel writers give us a little bit more detail. The impression is that he lived out in the tombs, that he cut himself with rocks, it would be kind of this awful presence. Can you imagine that? Somebody out in the cemetery, you're laying your kids to bed at night, and then you hear this shrieking out in the distance, this strange, unearthly sound of this maniac out there. What a strange presence that would be. And so the picture is that they tried to control the guy. They tried to do whatever was necessary to domesticate him. They put him into chains, they shackled his feet, and yet sort of like an inverse Samson, he breaks the chains, he's out there once again. They just can't seem to keep him under control. You ever met anybody like that? Probably not that bad. But I've met people, I can think of somebody right now, who just seemed to not be able to control herself. And you'd think, if I could just put this person into enough of a structured environment, put them in shackles, dominate every breath they take, every move they make, then possibly we could get this person moving in a good direction. I can recall having a conversation with this person, trying to reach their heart, and actually seeing tears running down this person's face. I naively thought I had reached her. It only took a few days, and right back into trouble once again. Right back into doing the most self-destructive, awful things. And I thought, what happened to that person I was talking to a couple of days ago? You ever had someone like that in your life? Somebody you just can't fathom. What is it that seizes them? It almost is like a demon that just takes over and runs them off in self-destructive, awful, antisocial behavior. And you think, what is this? And really I think a picture of that is being set before us by this text. They tried so hard. They'd used psychiatry. They'd used, Ritalin. They'd used whatever. They'd fed this guy every pill in the book. They'd tried every trick in the trade to try to bring this person under control, and yet just couldn't do it. There he was, right again, screaming, self-destructive, living in the tombs, living in that awful place. I imagine some of the townspeople had a little compassion. And yet, for all of that, you see, it was unavailing. Notice how it drives this person to radical isolation. Most commentators at least note this in passing, that part of what Luke wants to say to us is that when evil in our lives reaches its ultimate desired outcome, it leaves us in this utter isolation, a complete lonely existence. Paul makes an interesting comment in Romans chapter 7, personifying sin. He says, sin in our lives wants to become exceedingly sinful. It's quite a thought, isn't it? Every one of us is doing some battle somewhere in our lives with some sinful thing. Now for you, I'm sure it's absolutely subtle, because you all obviously are well advanced in your sanctification and well past, conspicuous awful problems. But all of us have a battleground somewhere. There is somewhere where the line is drawn and the battle is being joined, And what does that enemy on the other side want to do? It wants to become exceedingly sinful in your life. You think of that term. What do you think of when you think of a person who is given over to exceedingly sinful life? You think of somebody utterly drunk, face down in a gutter. You think of whatever image. That's where sin wants to take you. You see, that's what it wants you to be. That's its ultimate desire for you. Desire for your children. That's where sin wants to go in our lives. But it never starts there. It never comes to me when I'm feeling good and I'm doing reasonably well and says, hey, how about going and laying down in a gutter? What do you think? Doesn't that sound good? It's never that way. It always starts with the most innocuous, innocent, lovely, just kind of the thing that you would never think. It's just a tiny little compromise. And yet ultimately that's where it wants to take us. This man seems to picture for us, the ultimate destiny to which, as it were, these demons want all of us to wind up. All right, verse 30. Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Legion," because many demons had entered into him. In the Bible, names are important, you know that, all the way through. The name kind of stands for the essence of the person. And so a name will frequently have that overtone to it. If you know the name, you know the person. Naming also has to do with dominance. Probably the most dramatic story of this is the one you all know in the Old Testament in Genesis, where Jacob is wrestling with the angel, and the angel says to Jacob, as if he didn't know, "What is your name?" You know. And Jacob tells the name. Jacob, usurper, deceiver, supplanter. You know, Jacob, that's what the name meant. And what does the angel do? He changes his name. You'll no longer be called Jacob, you'll be called Israel, a prince with God, changing, as it were, the very identity of this person. Then Jacob says, "Well, what's your name?" Does the angel tell him his name? No. Because to give the name, in a sense, is to win the victory. In other words, if you demand someone's name and they're forced to give it to you, you win. You know. And in this case, the angel won, not Jacob. The angel changes the name. Jacob doesn't change anybody's name. What is your name? Jesus says. He doesn't change the name, but the very fact that he can, in a sense, demand to know the name, and it's immediately provided. It's like Jesus is taking names, you know what I mean? That's what he's doing. What is your name? I'll make a note of that, you know. Well, that's what he's the one in charge. He's the one who's exacting that. So what is the name? It's legion. The word legion was frequently, it stood generally in the ancient world for a military division, and a legion would typically be made up of 6,000 men, soldiers. You know, in the Roman army, a legion was 6,000. I don't know if that means that this man had 6,000 demons in him. I don't know. I don't know enough about demonology to have an opinion about that, but it certainly implies that there was this huge kind of population of horrible and probably conflicting passions that were just driving him, as we can see so clearly, insane. But how much, again, do we see a reflection of what sin does in our lives? It fills us not with a kind of united, reasonable, trajectory for life, but it just tears us apart. Paul talks about a double-minded man. He's unstable in all his ways. Can't figure out which way he's going. I don't know we don't hear this expression, I guess, so much anymore. But when I was in college, back in the 60s, kind of the phrase that you would always hear to these very confused young people, the boomers, You acquainted with the boomers? You'd ask, well, what's your life about? Well, I'm just trying to find myself. You ever heard that expression? Just trying to find myself. What does that reflect? I realize it can be fairly innocent, and so I'm trying to read too much into that expression. But it reflects, doesn't it, a kind of confusion. Who am I? What am I? And that's what sin does. It leaves us with this kind of conflicted inner torment, double-mindedness, quadruple-mindedness. I mean, we're just torn apart. Then what Jesus does is he unifies your life. He gives you a path upon which to walk, a destiny to pursue, a goal to achieve. It gives you a direction that makes sense. Teaches you what to eliminate, what to include, so that your life has some kind of sanity to it. This guy was just ripped apart by all of these conflicting powers that were controlling him. All right, so verse 31. And they besought him that he would not send them into the abyss. He would not send them into the abyss. And indeed, he doesn't yet. He does, in a sense, do something else. The ultimate mission of Christ was to defeat them utterly, to dispose of them eternally. But not yet. In a sense, there is this timetable that seems to be running out. All right, verse 32. There was there a herd of swine. A Jewish reader would read that and shudder, A herd of swine feeding on that mountain. And they, the demons, besought him to send them into those, the swine, and he sent them. Now, as I said earlier, the presence of these swine is in itself a bit of a mystery, but it does at least seem to represent some kind of illegitimate commercial activity in the region. We don't understand exactly what or why, what was going on, but that generally commentators seem to think that is at least intended to be applied here. So there's going to be Jesus, in a sense, now responding in a judgment with respect to the herding of the swine and redemptively with respect to the man who was being redeemed. You know the name Bertrand Russell. He wrote, of course, he was an atheist and liked to pick on Christians, and he wrote probably his most famous essay on the subject was entitled, "Why I Am Not a Christian." Who's ever read that? Anybody ever read that? You should. You can get it readily enough. You can get it online if you want, and it's worth reading. It's worth reading. Just to see how vacuous are the critiques of one of the most brilliant men of the 20th century when he turns his gun on the Christian faith. It should be encouraging to you to think, is that the best they've got? But anyway, he goes through. I won't take the time. I'll save that story. I'm already running late here. But in any event, Bertrand Russell, in his little critique of Christianity, mentions this story, and he criticizes Jesus for Jesus' dealings with the demons in this story. He says, there are times when Jesus did not behave as a good Christian. So that's interesting, is that the best that Bertrand Russell can come up with is that the best standard he can come up with to evaluate Jesus is Jesus. How do we do that exactly? But in any event, he says, Jesus didn't always live the life of a good Christian. And then he gives several examples, the cursing of the fig tree and stuff like that. But the one that he mentions is this deal with the demons. And he has two criticisms of Jesus with respect to this incident. One of them is that here we have Jesus negotiating with the demons. Why didn't Jesus just send them to hell? That's what Bertrand Russell asks. Of course, Bertrand Russell didn't believe in hell, so I don't know how he thought Jesus could send them there, but we'll leave that. The second criticism, though, more to our immediate point, Jesus is destroying innocent pigs. They didn't do anything wrong. Sort of like a animal rights kind of guy. That's the criticism that he's bringing to bear here. That why would Jesus torment these poor innocent animals that were there in that region? So those are his two. Well, the first one we've kind of alluded to. It may be Jesus didn't just send them to hell because it was premature. At least I think theologically we'd argue that. As to the second question, right on the face of it, one has to ask, well, which has more value? Here we have a man whose life has been salvaged, a man who has been in absolutely unspeakable torment and agony, who is, by the power of Christ, restored to soundness of physical and mental health, and it happens to be at the expense of some pigs. In the great economy of things, which has more value? Now, I realize there are people in the 21st century for whom that is a very perplexing question. But it is not a perplexing question from the biblical point of view, that there is a deep sense in which the human spirit, the human person, has inestimable, incalculable value. And that if Christ himself is willing to sacrifice the most priceless life of all to redeem such as us, then are we surprised if he will redeem a life at the expense of some pigs? I had nothing against pigs. I like pork as well as the next guy, But nevertheless, I think we have, the value system of the New Testament says to us that. Now, behind that, there is, of course, a whole lot of other questions. How does a demon possess a pig? And I don't know. I don't know if you've had any. If some of you in the question time may have some comments or thoughts or experience, I hope not, on that, but I'm just going to leave that. But in any event, that's where we'll have to leave it. There was this herd of pigs and so on. Verse 33, they went out, the demons went out from the man and entered into the swine, and the herd stampeded down the precipice into the lake and were choked. Mark tells us there were about 2,000 pigs. That'd be about 3 demons per pig if there were 6,000 demons. So There you are. Pigs do not normally head for the water. This was an unnatural reaction, kind of like the demons had produced a very unnatural reaction in the man. Now we see what torment he had been in this self-destructive kind of possession he'd been dealing with, as these pigs do something like that, of course, in the case of the pigs themselves. It was, in any event, a dramatic and frightening scene. I'm sure the herdsmen were just aghast, as their pigs go running down the side of the cliff there. And so we hear, not surprisingly, the next verse, when the herdsmen saw this, what had happened, they fled and reported in the city and in the country. So they just kind of go off in a mad panic, probably fearful concerning the possibility of their own responsibility. This was their job, of course, to be caring for these. To lose the whole herd was a great financial loss. They were further fearful, I suppose, of what else Jesus might be doing. The whole thing was just out of their world, and so they just run off in this kind of panic. And that brings us to verse 35. When they, referring to the town people, went out to see what had happened, they came to Jesus. And they found, and notice what Luke says, the man sitting, from whom the demons had been cast out, clothed, and in his right mind, there at the feet of Jesus, and they were terrified. So we find the three effects that Luke wants to highlight for us. The man had been in this awful kind of state of mind, just running around naked. Nakedness through the Bible is invariably connected, after the fall, is connected with one of the effects, one of the influences of sin on us. And whenever you find people fleeing naked or being naked, there's a kind of an overtone there of this awful situation of human existence where we're stripped and exposed. It is interesting to me, I'm just going to make this comment for your own just reflection. Paganism invariably tends toward the undressing of people and the dishonoring of their bodies. Paganism tends toward the undressing of people and the dishonoring of their bodies. The Christian gospel tends toward the proper, modest clothing of people and the honoring of their bodies. That sociologically, I don't know anything in the world you can demonstrate more easily than that, I grew up in a Baptist church, and I was treated to a parade of missionaries. Some of you had backgrounds like this. The missionary with his slides. You ever seen a missionary slideshow? And I don't know how many times in my life, and I'm glad for it. I'm appreciative of it. But invariably, the Sunday night service, and he'd set up the slide projector and show the slides. Now, can I be candid with you? Sometimes I kind of like those slides, because they would take pictures of these just village situations in radically third world countries, village, jungles, etc. And invariably, the people weren't wearing clothes. And as a 10-year-old boy, I was kind of going, whoa, that kind of thing. You know what I'm saying? Do you mind me being that honest with you? I don't know, but you probably learned something about me by this. But I just remember it so well. As the missionaries would tell the story, they would say that they'd start preaching the gospel, and they'd always show later pictures, and all the people would be dressed modestly. Yeah, have you noticed that? I don't know if you've noticed it from the slides, but maybe you just noticed it from culture. Isn't it the case that the world wants to strip us and expose us and shame us, and Christ wants to clothe you and give you honor? And the first thing we notice about this man is he's clothed. The second thing we notice about him is that he's sitting. He was ADD on steroids, a few minutes earlier. You couldn't get him to sit down for anything. You couldn't chain him down. You couldn't get him to restrain his actions. You talk about impulse control being absent. He was right out there in a whole different category. And how much do we look at our culture and we just see a total lack of impulse control? How much has that dominated culture, popular culture, What do you see this man doing? He's relaxed. There's peace. There's sanity. There's submission. He's sitting. at the feet of Jesus. There is no more intelligent posture or place for any human being than to be sitting at the feet of Jesus. How could it be better than that? And the third thing, of course, that Luke notes here, and he uses a kind of technical medical term, which Luke will frequently do, presuming his own medical background. He uses the term being right-minded. He was in his right mind. He was sane. He was oriented to place and time. And that, of course, I think, is the principal thing Luke wants us to learn. What is Jesus about? With all the other things he's doing to us, he's making us rational people. He's not making us rationalists, as if reason were God, like the French Enlightenment, putting this woman calling it reason and worshiping that. Heaven forbid, not that. But that we become fundamentally rational people, balanced people. People who aren't just off our rockers, in terms of what's going on in the world. That we have a kind of stability about us, mentally, physically, in all of those ways. That's what he gives us. That's his mission, to give us those great benefits. All right. That brings us, sorry I'm so glued to my notes today. This has been a week to remember, but I'm not going to tell you about it. So we're just going to leave it at that. Verse 36, we'll go on from there. So those who had seen listen to this verse. Those who had seen those things reported how the demon-possessed man had been not healed, but saved. Is Luke's word there. Esothe, had been saved. These are not believers. The people who had simply seen, as a matter of objective observation, reported how the man had been saved. If a person is saved, that is evident, not just to other Christian people, it's evident to everybody. And even these people who are not sharing in the redemptive benefits of Christ can report how the man was saved, And you would think there'd be a great deal of jubilation, wouldn't you? You'd think, well, finally we've solved this problem. This guy's been nothing but a terror. He's been driving us crazy. He's been, just the worst thorn in the ointment here, or fly in the ointment, whatever, for so long. It'd be nice. Now we've gotten past that. Isn't that great? You would think that'd be the response, and of course we find that it's just the opposite. So, verse 37, and all the crowd of the Gergesenes asked him to depart from them, because fear had seized them. So he himself went back to the boat in order to return. So Jesus upsets the status quo, and I don't know if their reason for wanting Jesus to depart was fear of economic collapse. Some commentators thought that, or more just the terror of one who could so totally disrupt, life as it had been, the status quo. I don't know. But there is an odd irony here. You have the unbelievers who are praying, in a sense, for Jesus to go away, and he does that. You have a believer who is praying that he can go with Jesus, and Jesus says no. So you have, in a sense, he answers the prayer of the unbeliever, and he refuses to answer as desired the prayer of the believer. There's an interesting irony, isn't it? Why in the world would Jesus not let this man go with him? I think that may be one of the most troubling little details of the story. What's up with this? Here's a man who wants to go with Jesus. Join him on the boat. Go back, be his follower. And Jesus says no. One commentator put it this way. Jesus answers some prayers in judgment and refuses others in mercy. There are some prayers you've prayed, and God has not answered them as you prayed them because he was being merciful to you, Now, I don't know exactly why, to be honest with you, and I've read, the commentators I've looked at this last week don't know either, to be honest with you. I've gotten some interesting theories, but none of them are worth wasting your time with them. But the fact of the matter is, it's mysterious. We don't know exactly why it was that Jesus said no. He certainly didn't say no to everybody who wanted to come to him, wanted to follow him. But for whatever reasons in this case, that's the negative answer Jesus gives. But while we, from this statement, may not know Jesus' reason, we don't have any reason to doubt his wisdom. That Jesus has wisdom that we don't know of, and in this case, apparently his wisdom dictated that this man should stay. He certainly gives him direction. He says, return to your own house, declare the great things God has done for you. And then in an interesting twist, Luke says, so he went to the whole city and reported what Christ, or what Jesus, had done for him. And at least implied in that is a little recognition of the deity of Christ. At least it seems that's what Luke is sort of implying in that. It's a great story. I think the fundamental meaning of the story is that he restored a man who seemed utterly hopeless to this state of sane balance, and that is what Christ wants to do in each of our lives and in the lives of the people we love. And so you can not do any greater favor for people you care about than to somehow get into their life and into their bloodstream the presence and the power of Christ. And he will do good things for them. Thank you all so much. It was great to have you here. Let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, we are deeply grateful for this wonderful story of a life that's redeemed. We thank you that even though his circumstances were unspeakably miserable, that for you this was no challenge, and that you could bring to him this deep and profound stability and sanity. And we're grateful that you can do and have done the same for us. We pray that we would continue to grow in that wisdom, that sound-mindedness, which is right for God's people. We give you thanks for all that we've been able to experience by seeing it through the eyes of this story this morning. In Jesus' name. Amen.